Abandoned and forgotten, Daniel Carter pulled his tattered military jacket tighter around his shoulders, the frigid winter air slicing through the worn fabric like invisible knives. The temperature had plummeted as night descended over the city, transforming the concrete landscape into a merciless frozen wasteland that showed no mercy to those without shelter. Once a proud Marine who had served his country with unwavering dedication, Daniel now fought a different kind of battle. One for daily survival on these unforgiving streets. His weathered face told the story of a man who had seen too much, both overseas and here at home. Deep lines etched around his eyes like a map of hardships endured, while his calloused hands, once steady enough to disarm explosives in war zones, now trembled slightly in the biting cold. The bustling city sidewalks had emptied as darkness fell, leaving Daniel alone with the howling wind that whistled between towering skyscrapers. Business people hurried past in expensive coats, eyes averted, creating a deliberate blindness to his existence. He had become invisible, a ghost haunting the periphery of a world that had no place for broken heroes. "Spare some change." Daniel's voice was barely audible as a well-dressed couple rushed by, their laughter cutting through the night air as they pulled each other close for warmth. They didn't even glance his way. No one ever did. The cardboard box he'd carefully salvaged from behind the grocery store offered little protection from the elements, but it was all he had. Daniel arranged it meticulously in the sheltered doorway of an abandoned storefront, his movements practiced and precise, a shadow of the military discipline that once structured his life. From his coat pocket, he withdrew a small framed photograph, its edges worn smooth from years of handling. 3 smiling faces looked back at him, himself in uniform, standing proudly beside his wife and daughter. Before the nightmares came, before the drinking, before he lost everything. A solitary snowflake drifted down, landing on the glass covering his daughter's face. Daniel gently wiped it away with his thumb, careful not to smudge the precious image. More snowflakes followed, dancing in the glow of streetlights before settling on the pavement, transforming the harsh urban landscape into something almost beautiful. The distant sound of police sirens wailed through the city, an urban lullaby that Daniel had grown accustomed to. He knew what would happen next. They'd come through and clear out anyone sleeping in doorways. "Move along," they'd say, as if there was somewhere to move to. Daniel tucked the photograph safely back into his pocket and gathered his meager belongings. The shelter across town might have a bed tonight, though it was a mile's walk through the snowfall. His old knee injury flared with pain at the thought, a permanent souvenir from his final deployment. As he stepped out from his temporary sanctuary into the swirling snow, Daniel's breath formed clouds in the frigid air. The city continued its indifferent hum around him, a vast machine of light and noise that had no place for those who had fallen through its cracks. "Thief!" The accusation cut through the quiet hum of the gas station like a gunshot, freezing Daniel Carter in his tracks. The styrofoam cup of coffee trembled in his grip, wisps of steam rising like ghosts into the fluorescent-lit air. It had been his first hot drink in 3 days, purchased with the last 1.89 in his pocket, coins he'd collected one by one from sidewalk cracks and forgotten corners. The cashier's face contorted with suspicion, eyes narrowing as he pointed a finger directly at Daniel's chest. "Empty your pockets now!" The young man's voice cracked with authority he didn't quite possess, his gas station uniform still crisp and new. Daniel stood motionless, confusion washing over his weathered features as other customers turned to stare. "Sir, I paid for this," Daniel said softly, his voice carrying the weight of dignity he refused to surrender. He carefully placed the coffee on the counter and reached into his pocket with trembling fingers, producing only lint and the treasured photograph of his family. The last reminder of a life that now felt like someone else's dream. The security Camera in the corner blinked its red eye emotionlessly, recording the humiliation unfolding beneath it. Daniel's military training had taught him to stand tall in the face of adversity, but something in his chest crumbled as whispers rippled through the store. Judgments formed before truth could surface. A homeless man must be guilty. "I saw you." "And take something from the shelf," the cashier insisted, growing bolder with each word. "Turn out your pockets completely, or I'm calling the police." The mention of police sent a chill through Daniel's body that had nothing to do with the winter air still clinging to his clothes. Another night in a holding cell would break something in him that might never mend. An elderly woman in line behind Daniel shifted uncomfortably, clutching her purse tighter against her body as though his desperation might be contagious. A businessman checked his watch impatiently, muttering about these people, just loud enough to be heard. Daniel's fingers fumbled with the zipper of his worn jacket, pulling it open to reveal nothing but layers of threadbare clothing. Shame burned hot in his throat as he emptied every pocket, placing each pitiful possession on the counter. 7 cents in change, a library card expired 3 years ago, a button, a safety pin that held his pants together. "Check the cameras," Daniel suggested, his voice quiet but unwavering. "Please." The plea hung in the air, suspended between accusation and vindication. The manager emerged from the back room, drawn by the commotion. His eyes flicked from Daniel to the cashier, then to the small pile of belongings spread across the counter. Like evidence of a life unraveled. "What's going on here, Jason?" The manager's voice carried authority the young cashier couldn't match. "He stole something, I saw him," Jason insisted, though uncertainty now crept into his tone. The manager glanced at the security monitor behind the counter, rewinding the footage with practiced efficiency. The store fell silent as images flickered. Across the screen, Daniel entering, counting coins carefully, paying for his coffee and nothing more. Then came the revelation that changed everything. The screen showed another customer, a teenager in a bright red jacket, slipping a candy bar into his pocket before hurrying out the door. "Wrong person," the manager said flatly, turning to Daniel with an expression caught between embarrassment and dismissal. Daniel stood motionless, dignity hanging by a thread as thin as his worn-out coat, while his coffee grew cold on the counter. The simple comfort he had sacrificed his last dollars for, now transformed into a monument to humiliation. Hands against the wall, Officer Richard Jacobs burst through the gas station doors, his commanding presence instantly dominating the small space. The fluorescent lights glinted off his polished badge as his hand rested instinctively on his holster. 23 years on the force had hardened his gaze into something impenetrable, a shield built from thousands of lies he'd heard from countless desperate people. "What seems to be the problem here?" His voice cut through the tension like a blade, authoritative and unwavering. His eyes scanned the scene, quickly settling on Daniel's weathered form. Officer Jacobs had seen this scenario play out 100 times before. A disheveled man causing trouble, disrupting honest businesses, just trying to make it through the day. The young cashier pointed accusingly, his earlier confidence bolstered by the officer's arrival. He was acting suspicious, moving around the store weird. "I thought he took something." Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs as Officer Jacobs approached, the familiar smell of leather and authority surrounding him. He had encountered men like this during his lowest moments on the streets, officers who saw the dirt on his clothes before they saw the man wearing them. "Sir, I didn't take anything," Daniel said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "There was a mistake. The manager just checked the security footage. I'll be asking the questions." Officer Jacobs interrupted, positioning himself between Daniel and the exit. His eyes swept over Daniel's appearance, the frayed jacket, the worn-out boots, the unmistakable weariness of a man who carried his home on his back. In Jacob's experience, men who looked like this rarely told the truth. The manager stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Officer, there seems to have been a misunderstanding. The cameras show..." "I'll review that in a minute," Jacob said, cutting him off without taking his eyes off Daniel. "First, I need some identification." He extended his hand expectantly, palm up, a gesture that brooked no argument. Daniel's fingers trembled slightly as he reached into his jacket, producing a tattered VA identification card. The plastic was worn, the edges softened by years spent in pockets, but his name and service information remained visible beneath the scratches. Officer Jacobs glanced at the ID, his expression unchanging as he read, "Daniel Carter, United States Marine Corps." Just another vet who couldn't readjust, he thought. He'd seen too many of them, good soldiers who came back broken and ended up causing problems for everyone else. "You hanging around here bothering customers, Carter?" Jacobs asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. The elderly woman, who'd been standing behind Daniel in line, suddenly spoke up, her voice thin but determined. "He was just buying coffee, officer. I saw him pay for it." Jacobs barely acknowledged her, his attention fixed on Daniel. "Empty your pockets," he commanded, gesturing with 2 fingers. "All of them." Daniel complied silently, his military training resurfacing in the presence of authority. For the second time that day, he laid out his meager possessions on the counter, the photograph, the few pennies, nothing that could be mistaken for stolen merchandise. The manager pointed to the security monitor. "Officer, if you'll just look at this footage, the person who actually took something left before you arrived. This man didn't do anything wrong." Officer Jacobs remained unmoved, his judgment already formed like concrete setting around Daniel's feet. In his world, people like Daniel were always guilty of something. If not today, then yesterday or tomorrow. It was just a matter of finding out what. "We'll sort this out at the station," Jacob said, reaching for his handcuffs. "Turn around, hands behind your back." The cold metal clasped around his wrists. Daniel Carter felt the handcuffs tighten with a decisive click, the sound echoing through the now silent gas station. Officer Jacobs secured them with practiced efficiency, each movement a testimony to years of arrests, just like this one. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across Daniel's face, highlighting the moment his dignity was stripped away. "Please, officer," Daniel's voice cracked barely above a whisper. "I didn't take anything. I'm a veteran. I just wanted some coffee." His words hung in the air, evaporating like the steam from his abandoned cup, still sitting on the counter, a simple comfort now transformed into evidence in an imaginary crime. Officer Jacobs responded by reciting Miranda rights with mechanical precision, each word delivered with the emotionless cadence of a man who had spoken these same sentences thousands of times before. The ritual of arrest played out beneath the buzzing lights, a dance of power and submission choreographed by a system that had long ago stopped seeing individuals. Around them, the gas station had fallen eerily silent. Customers stood frozen in place, witnessing the scene unfold like a tragic play. A teenage girl raised her phone, its camera lens capturing every moment with unflinching digital clarity. A businessman in an expensive suit lowered his eyes, suddenly fascinated by the floor tiles. The elderly woman who had spoken up earlier clutched her purse tighter, lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval, but her protest had died in her. "In throat, someone please tell him," Daniel pleaded, looking around at the faces of strangers who could save him with a single word of truth. The manager checked the cameras. "It wasn't me." The store manager stood behind the counter, his fingers nervously tapping on the surface. "Officer, if you would just look at the footage," he began, his voice faltering as Jacobs turned his steel gaze toward him. "I'll review all evidence at the station," Jacobs responded, the dismissal clear in his tone. "Right now, I'm responding to a reported theft." Through the gas station windows, the glow of smartphones illuminated the faces of passers-by who had stopped to record the scene. Their fingers tapped share buttons, spreading the moment across digital networks without context or conclusion. In their eyes, Daniel could see himself transformed into content, a viral moment rather than a human being caught in a terrible mistake. Daniel's legs felt weak as Officer Jacobs guided him toward the exit, a firm hand gripping his upper arm. The automatic doors slid open, releasing a blast of cold night air that cut through his thin jacket. The police cruiser waited outside, its red and blue lights painting the parking lot in alternating colors of emergency. "I fought for this country," Daniel said, his voice breaking as they approached the vehicle. The words were not meant as a plea for special treatment, but as a desperate reminder that he was more than what they saw. More than a homeless man, more than a suspect, more than another body to process through the system. Officer Jacobs's expression remained unchanged as he opened the rear door of the cruiser. "We all have stories, sir. You can tell yours to the booking officer." As Daniel was guided into the back seat, he caught a final glimpse of the gas station. Through the windows, he could see the customers resuming their lives, the momentary disruption already fading. The cashier was wiping down the counter, erasing the last evidence of Daniel's presence. No one was rushing out to stop this injustice. No one was calling out the truth. The door slammed shut with finality, sealing Daniel inside the cage of the police cruiser. Through the window, he watched the world continue without him, indifferent to the mistake that was carrying him away into the night. Forgotten hero behind bars. The holding cell's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects, casting a sickly pallor across Daniel Carter's exhausted face. The concrete bench beneath him had long ago surrendered any pretense of comfort, its cold surface seeping through his worn jeans and into his bones. Around him, the police station hummed with activity. Phones ringing, keyboards clicking, the occasional burst of laughter from officers whose shift would end with them returning to warm homes. Daniel sat motionless, his handcuffed wrists resting. In his lap, eyes fixed on a crack in the floor that spiderwebbed across the grey concrete. 3 hours had passed since Officer Jacobs had processed him, photographed him, taken his fingerprints, each action another brick in the wall of humiliation being built around him. No one had listened when he tried to explain. The words veteran and mistake had fallen on deaf ears, drowned out by the machinery of a system designed to process, not understand. Officer Jenny Ramirez shifted uncomfortably in her chair, the leather squeaking beneath her as she scrolled through Daniel's file on her computer screen. 3 weeks out of the academy, she still wore her uniform with a crispness that veterans of the force had long abandoned. This was her first night processing intake forms alone, and she was determined to do everything by the book. "Carter, Daniel, J," she murmured to herself, fingers tapping methodically as she entered his information. Date of birth, last known address, none. Charges, suspected theft, though no evidence had been found on him, all routine until she reached his service record. Her fingers froze above the keyboard. "That can't be right," she whispered, leaning closer to the screen as if proximity might change what she was seeing. She clicked on a link, opening a more detailed military file, and felt something tighten in her chest as the screen filled with commendations. United States Marine Corps. 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart, citations for extraordinary heroism under fire, letters of commendation from commanding officers. Her eyes darted to the holding cell where Daniel sat, shoulders slumped, looking nothing like the decorated hero described in these records. The man who had pulled 3 fellow Marines from a burning vehicle under enemy fire now couldn't even buy a cup of coffee without being accused of theft. Officer Ramirez glanced around the station. The night shift was understaffed as usual, with Officer Jacobs having left for patrol again, and the sergeant buried in paperwork in his office. A lump formed in her throat as she looked back at the screen, at the photograph of a younger Daniel Carter in dress blues, standing tall with medals gleaming on his chest. "This isn't right," she whispered to herself, her rookie idealism not yet. Weathered away by years on the force, she reached for the phone, her decision made before she even knew who she was calling. The station's coffee machine gurgled in the background as she dialed a number she'd memorized during her training. Veterans advocacy group run by a retired police captain. Her eyes remained fixed on Daniel through the holding cell's reinforced glass as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times. "Hello?" A gruff voice finally answered. "Captain Reynolds, this is Officer Ramirez from the 5th Precinct. I need your help with something urgent." Her voice lowered as she turned away from the holding cell. "There's been a terrible mistake." Through the glass, Daniel remained motionless, unaware that the wheels of justice, true justice, had finally begun to turn. In his mind, he was already planning where he would try to find shelter once they released him in the morning, not knowing that by sunrise, everything would change. Is that really him? The question rippled through the police station like electricity, sparking from desk to desk as the night shift slowly awakened to the magnitude of their error. Officer Jenny Ramirez's discovery had transformed from whispered concern to urgent crisis in the span of 20 minutes. The fluorescent lights seemed to burn brighter as officers gathered in small clusters, stealing glances toward the holding cell where Daniel Carter sat, unaware of the storm brewing around him. Sergeant Miller, a 20-year veteran of the force, with salt and pepper hair and perpetually tired eyes, leaned over Ramirez's shoulder, squinting at the computer screen. His coffee breath mingled with the station's antiseptic smell as he read through Daniel's service record, his expression darkening with each medal, each commendation that scrolled past. "Silver Star," he muttered, the weight of those 2 words hanging in the air. This man pulled 3 Marines from a burning Humvee under heavy fire. His weathered finger tapped the screen where a citation described how Daniel had returned to the vehicle despite sustaining shrapnel wounds to his legs. Inside, Officer Ramirez felt her throat tighten. "And we arrested him for stealing a cup of coffee he actually paid for." The sergeant straightened, running a hand across his face. "Where's Jacobs?" "Still on patrol, sir." "Call him back. Now." Through the reinforced glass, Daniel remained motionless. On the concrete bench, his shoulders hunched against the world, unaware that his identity was spreading through the station like wildfire. The photograph in his pocket, his only remaining treasure, had been logged into his personal effects, separated from him by a locked drawer and a growing sense of institutional shame. At a nearby desk, Officer Thompson, a former Army Ranger, scrolled through his phone with increasing agitation. "I found more," he called out, holding up his screen. "There was an article about him 3 years ago. After he came home, he worked with veteran support groups until..." His voice trailed off. "Until what?" Ramirez asked, stepping closer. "Until his wife and daughter were killed by a drunk driver while he was at a PTSD support meeting. He spiraled after that, lost everything." The silence that followed pressed against the walls of the station like a physical force. Through the glass, Daniel Carter, hero, widower, homeless veteran, stared at his handcuffed wrists, utterly alone. Sergeant Miller's voice cut through the quiet. "This is a PR nightmare waiting to happen. Those cell phone videos from the gas station are probably already online." Ramirez felt something harden inside her chest, a resolve that transcended concerns about public relations or department image. "With all due respect, sir, that's not the point," she said, her rookie boldness surprising even herself. "We arrested a decorated Marine for something he didn't do. We need to make this right." The sergeant's eyes narrowed momentarily before softening with reluctant agreement. "What do you suggest, officer?" Ramirez glanced at her watch, 1:47 a.m., then back at Daniel. She reached for her phone, scrolling through contacts until she found the number she needed. "Sir, I'd like your permission to call Captain Reynolds." "Befi." Room fell silent. Captain James Reynolds wasn't just a retired police officer, he was a Marine veteran himself, who now ran the largest veterans advocacy organization in the state. He had connections reaching from City Hall to the Pentagon, and a reputation for moving mountains when it came to protecting those who had served. "That's going over a lot of heads, Ramirez," the sergeant warned, though there was no real resistance in his tone. "Yes, sir," she agreed, her finger already hovering over the call button. But so did he when he ran into that burning Humvee. The sergeant studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. "Make the call." As Ramirez stepped away, phone pressed to her ear, eyes remained fixed on the solitary figure in the holding cell. A hero forgotten by the country he had sacrificed everything to protect, about to be remembered. The ground trembled as they approached. The quiet night outside the precinct erupted into controlled chaos as a convoy of military vehicles rolled down the empty street, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights on a mission. The rumble of engines shattered the stillness, drawing night shift officers to the windows in disbelief. 3 armored Humvees and a sleek black SUV with government plates formed a precisely aligned formation in front of the station, their sudden appearance transforming the mundane building into the epicenter of something extraordinary. Officer Ramirez stood frozen in the doorway, her phone call to Captain Reynolds having set in motion forces far beyond what she had anticipated. The station's fluorescent lighting spilled onto the sidewalk, illuminating the vehicles as their engines fell silent in perfect unison. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then, like a choreographed military operation, doors swung open simultaneously. Polished boots hit the pavement with purpose. Not the casual arrival of visitors, but the deliberate presence of a mission. 6 uniformed soldiers emerged from the Humvees, forming a perfect corridor leading to the station entrance. From the black SUV stepped a figure whose very posture commanded attention. Colonel James Harris adjusted his cap with practiced precision, his chest adorned with rows of ribbons and medals that caught the light with each movement. His weathered face bore the imprint of decades of service, every line and crease a testament to battles fought and decisions made that had shaped history. From the shadows, "That's Colonel Harris," whispered Sergeant Miller, suddenly appearing beside Ramirez, "head of Special Operations Command for the entire Eastern Seaboard. What the hell is he doing here?" The colonel's eyes swept over the precinct building, taking in every detail with the calculated assessment of a man accustomed to evaluating tactical situations. Behind him emerged 2 more officers, their insignia marking them as a major and a captain, moving with the synchronized efficiency of men who had served together through impossible circumstances. Inside the station, word spread like wildfire. Officers scrambled to attention, hastily straightening uniforms and clearing desks. The night dispatcher nearly dropped her coffee as she pressed her nose against the window, watching the military procession approach. "Is this about Carter?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the sudden flurry of activity. Sergeant Miller nodded slowly, his expression a mixture of awe and apprehension. Ramirez made one phone call. What kind of man generates this response with a single call? The answer walked through the precinct doors with measured steps. Colonel Harris removed his cap as he entered, revealing silver-gray hair cut with military precision. His gaze moved methodically around the room before settling on Sergeant Miller with laser focus. "I understand you're holding Sergeant Major Daniel Carter," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to having his words transformed instantly into action. It wasn't a question. In the holding cell, oblivious to the commotion, Daniel remained slumped on the bench, eyes closed in exhaustion. The homeless veteran, the forgotten hero, had no idea that the full weight of military command was now standing in the station lobby, prepared to move heaven and earth for one of their own. "Sir?" the major behind Colonel Harris spoke up, checking his watch with practiced efficiency. "The general is expecting our call in 10 minutes. Colonel Harris nodded once, his eyes never leaving Sergeant Miller's increasingly pale face. Then we have 9 minutes to correct this situation. He extended his hand, palm up, expectant. The release papers, please. Outside, the Humvees waited, engines still warm, while inside, the machinery of military precision stood ready to reclaim a hero the world had forgotten, but the army had not. The station fell silent as Colonel Harris stood at the center of the squad room, his commanding presence transforming the mundane police precinct into something that felt more like a military tribunal. The fluorescent lights caught the polished insignia on his uniform, casting reflections across the walls like silent witnesses to the confrontation about to unfold. Officers pressed themselves against desks and walls, creating a perfect circle of tension around the colonel and sergeant. "Miller, where is Officer Jacobs?" Colonel Harris's voice was controlled yet resonant, carrying the unmistakable tone of a man accustomed to having his questions answered immediately. As if summoned by the very utterance of his name, the front doors swung open. Officer Jacobs strode in, his usual confident swagger momentarily faltering as he registered the military presence that had invaded his territory. His eyes darted from face to face, searching for explanation in the tense expressions of his colleagues. "Sir," Sergeant Miller gestured toward the newcomer, "this is Officer Richard Jacobs." Colonel Harris turned slowly, deliberately, fixing Jacobs with a gaze that had made hardened soldiers stand at attention in war zones across the globe. "Officer Jacobs," he said, each syllable measured and precise. "I'd like you to explain why Sergeant Major Daniel Carter, Silver Star recipient and one of the most decorated Marines of his generation, is sitting handcuffed in your holding cell over a cup of coffee that security footage confirms he paid for." Jacobs's jaw tightened, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his belt near his badge. "With all due respect, Colonel, I was responding to a call about a disturbance. The subject was causing problems at a local business." The subject? The colonel's eyebrow raised a fraction of an inch, a subtle movement that somehow carried more weight than a shouted reprimand. "Sergeant Major Carter has a name, Officer Jacobs, a name that appears on monuments honoring the fallen members of his unit that he couldn't save, despite earning his Silver Star trying." A muscle in Jacobs's cheek twitched. "I wasn't aware of his service record at the time, sir. He appeared to be just another homeless troublemaker. We get dozens like him every week." The major standing behind Colonel Harris stepped forward, his voice razor-sharp. "Just another homeless troublemaker? Is that how your department classifies veterans who've lost everything after serving their country?" Jacobs straightened his shoulders, doubling down rather than retreating. "My job is to maintain order, not verify the military history of every vagrant causing problems in local businesses." He was acting erratically. The cashier was concerned. Captain Reynolds, the veteran advocate Officer Ramirez had called, stepped into the confrontation, a folder clutched in his hand. "Acting erratically. According to the security footage I've just reviewed, he was standing quietly at the counter paying for coffee with counted change." He slapped the folder against Jacobs's chest. "What part of that registered as erratic to you, officer?" Jacobs refused to take the folder, his stance growing more defensive with each passing second. "Look, I've been on this beat for 15 years. I know trouble when I see it. If he had just cooperated..." "Cooperated?" Colonel Harris cut him off, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "Sergeant Major Carter has 3 Purple Hearts. He cooperated by taking enemy fire so men like you could sleep safely at night. He cooperated by pulling 3 of his brothers from a burning vehicle while his own flesh melted from the heat." The squad room seemed to hold its collective breath as Colonel Harris stepped closer to Jacobs, close enough that the officer had to resist the urge to step back. "While you were giving parking tickets, Officer Jacobs, Daniel Carter was making decisions that saved American lives in conditions you cannot begin to imagine. The colonel's eyes never wavered, and this is how you thank him. Abandoned hero. Colonel Harris stood at the center of the police station, a living monument to military authority, surrounded by stunned officers frozen in place. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife as he reached into his jacket and withdrew a worn manila folder. The overhead lights cast dramatic shadows across his face as he opened it, revealing documents stamped with government seals and military insignia. "Let me tell you who Daniel Carter really is," the colonel began, his voice dropping to a tone that commanded everyone to lean forward. "Before you saw a homeless man, before you saw a nuisance, before you decided he was nothing but trouble." Officer Jacobs shifted uncomfortably, his earlier arrogance dissolving under the colonel's unwavering gaze. The entire station had fallen silent, even the ringing phone suddenly muted, as if the building itself was listening. "Captain Daniel Carter," Colonel Harris continued, emphasizing the rank, led one of the most effective special operations units in Afghanistan. His team specialized in high-risk extractions of personnel in hostile territories. In layman's terms, when our people were in impossible situations, we sent Daniel to bring them home. The colonel pulled a photograph from the folder, a younger Daniel in desert camouflage, standing tall beside his team, their faces confident and alive with purpose. The image passed from hand to hand among the officers, the stark contrast between that proud soldier and the broken man in their holding cell growing more painful with each officer who viewed it. 4 years ago, Captain Carter's unit was ambushed during an extraction mission. Despite sustaining multiple gunshot wounds, he managed to coordinate an evacuation that saved 17 American lives, including 2 critically wounded intelligence officers whose information later prevented 3 major terrorist attacks on U.S. soil. Colonel Harris's voice tightened, the only indication that the story affected him personally. Daniel was the last man out. The helicopter took heavy fire during extraction. A round penetrated the cabin and severed his spine at T10. He spent 11 months in a military hospital learning to walk again. Officer Ramirez pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes darting toward the holding cell where Daniel sat unaware of his story being told. "He received an honorable discharge with full honors," the colonel continued, "but the system that promised to take care of him failed at every turn. His disability payments were delayed for months due to paperwork issues. His medical coverage was insufficient for the ongoing treatment he needed, and while he fought these bureaucratic battles, his wife and daughter were killed by a drunk driver." The station remained deathly quiet, the collective shame almost palpable as the colonel closed the folder with a decisive snap. Within 18 months, one of America's finest officers went from leading elite missions to sleeping under highway overpasses. His PTSD, exacerbated by grief and physical pain, made maintaining employment nearly impossible. The VA waiting lists for mental health services stretched for months. His requests for assistance were buried in red tape. Colonel Harris turned to face Officer Jacobs directly, his eyes reflecting decades of witnessing the best and worst of humanity. "And tonight, officer, you put handcuffs on him because a cashier made a mistake about a cup of coffee." The folder slapped against Jacobs' chest as the colonel pressed it firmly into his hands. "This is who you arrested tonight. This is the man sitting in your cell, not some troublemaker, not some vagrant, a hero who gave everything for his country only to have that country turn its back when he needed it most." Outside the station windows, the military vehicles waited, their powerful engines occasionally rumbling like distant thunder, a reminder that forces far greater than this precinct's authority had now taken interest in Daniel Carter's fate. Surrounded by witnesses, the first video hit social media at 2:17 a.m., shaky footage from the gas station showing Daniel Carter in handcuffs, his weathered face a mask of quiet dignity as Officer Jacobs led him away. By 3:05 a.m., the story had grown wings, soaring across digital platforms with devastating speed. The hashtag #MarchYourVeteranArrested began trending, followed quickly by Justice for Daniel. Officer Jacobs stood at the window of the precinct, watching in disbelief as the empty street outside transformed into a sea of concerned faces. What had begun as a handful of curious onlookers had swelled into a pulsing crowd that stretched beyond the glow of the streetlights. The night air vibrated with voices, some angry, some sorrowful, all unified in purpose. "This can't all be for him," Jacobs muttered, his confident facade cracking like thin ice beneath spring sun. But the evidence was undeniable. News vans had arrived, their satellite dishes extending skyward like mechanical flowers searching for signal. Camera lights cut through the darkness, illuminating hand-painted signs bearing messages that pierced. Jacobs's professional armor. "Heroes deserve better, and he served us. We failed him." Most unsettling were the veterans, dozens of them standing in perfect formation at the front of the crowd, many still in uniform, their silent presence more powerful than any shouted protest. They stood shoulder to shoulder, creating a living wall of service and sacrifice, their eyes fixed on the station doors with the unwavering focus of men and women who understood exactly what Daniel Carter had endured. Inside, the station hummed with frantic activity. Phones rang continuously, each call another outraged citizen demanding answers. Sergeant Miller huddled with the department's public relations officer, their hushed conversation punctuated by expressions of growing alarm. "The mayor's office is on line 1, called the dispatcher, her voice tight with stress. "And the governor's office is holding on line 2. Jacobs turned away from the window, a cold weight settling in his stomach as reality finally penetrated his defenses. The weight of Colonel Harris's words pressed down on him like a physical force. He moved with uncharacteristic uncertainty to his desk, sinking into his chair as if his bones had suddenly hollowed. On his computer screen, the security footage from the gas station played on loop, evidence he should have reviewed hours ago. There was Daniel, carefully counting coins for his coffee. There was the teenager in the red jacket, slipping merchandise into his pocket. There was the truth, clear as day, that Jacobs had been too arrogant to see. "I made a mistake," he whispered, the admission barely audible even to himself. Officer Ramirez approached cautiously, setting a cup of coffee on his desk. "Colonel Harris is releasing him now," she said simply. Through the open door of the sergeant's office, Jacobs could see Daniel seated in a chair, Colonel Harris kneeling before him at eye level, speaking with the gentle respect one warrior offers. Another. Daniel's handcuffs were gone, his shoulders still hunched but his head finally raised, as if some small fraction of his dignity had been restored. The crowd outside had begun singing, the slow, solemn notes of a military hymn rising. Into the night sky, the sound filtered through the station walls, a requiem for a justice system that had failed one of its heroes. Jacob's phone buzzed with a notification. Another video had gone viral, this one from inside the gas station, capturing his dismissive treatment of Daniel in high definition. In the video, his own face looked foreign to him now, cold, uncaring, certain of authority that now felt hollow. "What have I done?" he whispered, the question disappearing into the growing chorus of voices, demanding accountability for a hero wrongfully accused. "Pride refuses to bend." Officer Jacobs stood awkwardly at the threshold of the interview room, his uniform suddenly feeling tight around his neck as if the fabric itself had turned against him. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across, his face illuminating every line of discomfort as he watched Daniel Carter gather the few possessions that had been taken from him. The worn photograph, 7 pennies, a tattered veteran's ID card. "Mr. Carter," Jacobs began, his voice stripped of its earlier authority. The words stuck in his throat like thorns, pride wrestling with the dawning horror of his mistake. "I need to speak with you." Daniel's fingers paused over his belongings, but he didn't look up. His shoulders remained squared, a ghost of military bearing that years on the streets hadn't completely erased. The silence between them stretched like a chasm too wide to cross with mere words. "I made a mistake tonight," Jacobs continued, each syllable painfully extracted. "I should have investigated more thoroughly before." He trailed off, the admission incomplete, hovering in the air between them. Daniel finally raised his eyes, meeting Jacob's gaze with a calm dignity that made the officer suddenly aware of the vast gulf between them. Not just of circumstance, but of character. In Daniel's weathered face was the unspoken weight of battles fought, lives saved, and sacrifices made that Jacobs could never truly comprehend. "Before arresting me for buying coffee?" Daniel's voice was quiet but unwavering, carrying the same command presence that had once led men into combat. "Or before assuming I was just another homeless nuisance?" Outside the interview room windows, the crowd had grown larger, their voices rising like a tide against the station walls. Camera flashes occasionally burst through the blinds, creating strobing patterns across the floor between the two men. "I didn't know who you were," Jacobs said, the excuse sounding hollow even to his own ears. "That's the problem, isn't it?" Daniel carefully folded the photograph of his family and slipped it into his pocket, the gesture performed with reverence. "You shouldn't have needed to know I was a decorated officer to treat me with basic dignity." Through the glass partition, Colonel Harris could be seen speaking with reporters, his military bearing a stark contrast to the nervous energy of the police department's public relations officer beside him. The story was already spiraling beyond anyone's control, becoming a symbol of something much larger than one wrongful arrest. "I am sorry," Jacob said, the words finally emerging unadorned. "Truly." Daniel stood, wincing slightly as he put weight on his bad leg, a permanent souvenir from the battlefield. Even in his worn clothes, with his unshaven face and the visible marks of street life, he somehow managed to project an aura of innate authority that made Jacobs unconsciously straighten his posture. "I accept your apology, officer," Daniel said, his tone neither warm nor cold but measured. "But I'm not the only veteran sleeping rough tonight. I'm just the one lucky enough to have a colonel remember my name." He gathered his belongings with deliberate movements, each item tucked away, with the precision of a man accustomed to carrying his entire life in his pockets. "Your apology means nothing if you go back to treating the next homeless veteran the same way." As Daniel turned to leave, Officer Ramirez appeared at the door, holding a steaming cup of coffee. "I thought you might want this, sir," she said, offering it with a gesture of genuine respect. "It's fresh." Daniel accepted the cup with a nod of thanks, the simple kindness momentarily softening his expression. He took a sip before turning back. To Jacobs one final time, "Tomorrow I'll still be homeless," he said quietly. "Will you still be the same officer?" A life transformed in an instant. Colonel Harris stood tall beside Daniel Carter as they stepped through the police station doors into the crisp night air. Camera flashes erupted like lightning, momentarily blinding them both as reporters surged. Forward, microphones extended like weapons. The crowd parted before them, veterans snapping to attention, civilians stepping back in respectful silence, creating a pathway through the sea of faces. The colonel's hand rested firmly on Daniel's shoulder, steadying him against the overwhelming wave of attention. For a man who had spent years becoming invisible to society, the sudden spotlight felt more disorienting than any battlefield chaos he had ever navigated. "This way, Sergeant Major," Colonel Harris murmured, guiding Daniel toward the waiting black SUV, its engine purring with quiet power. The vehicle represented more than just transportation. It was a tangible symbol of authority, of resources, of a world Daniel had long ago accepted was no longer his. Once inside, the door closed with a heavy thunk, sealing them in blessed silence. The tinted windows transformed the crowd into shadowy silhouettes, their voices muted to a distant hum. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he clutched his coffee cup, the warmth seeping into his calloused fingers. "Where are you taking me?" he asked, his voice hoarse from disuse. The street shelters would be filled by now, and his usual doorway had likely been claimed by another of the city's forgotten. Colonel Harris studied him for a long moment, his eyes reflecting a complex mixture of respect and regret. "That depends. On you, Daniel," he said finally. "I have a proposition." The SUV pulled away from the curb, leaving the commotion behind as it glided through empty streets. Daniel watched the familiar landscape of his homelessness, the park benches, the underpasses, the darkened alleys, slip past the window like a life he was suddenly viewing from the outside. "Fort Hamilton is establishing a new training program," the colonel continued, his tone shifting to one of measured purpose. "We're losing too many veterans to the streets, to addiction, to suicide. The brass finally understands we need soldiers who've been there to show us how to fix the system." Daniel's gaze remained fixed on the window, watching his reflection superimposed over the passing city lights. "I'm not exactly a success story, sir. You're exactly what we need," Harris countered. "Someone who fell through every crack in the system and survived to tell about it. Someone who can stand in front of a room of fresh-faced officers and make them understand what happens when we fail our own." The vehicle turned onto the highway, accelerating toward the military base that lay 30 miles outside the city limits. The colonel reached into his briefcase and withdrew a folder, placing it gently on Daniel's lap. "3 things," he said, tapping the folder with his index finger. "First, a position training new recruits about veteran reintegration. Your experience, both in combat and on the streets, makes you uniquely qualified." His finger moved to a different section of the papers. "Second, a leadership role in our veteran rehabilitation program, working directly with soldiers struggling with the same battles you've fought." Daniel's fingers hovered over the documents, hesitant to touch something that felt so fragile. "Hope." "And a third?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. "Housing on base, medical care for your injuries, both visible and invisible, a proper support system." The colonel's voice softened. "And a chance to honor the memory of your family by ensuring no other veteran walks the path you were forced to walk." Daniel closed his eyes, feeling the weight of possibility press against his chest, heavier than any rucksack he had ever carried in combat, yet somehow lifting him up rather than pulling him down. "Why now?" he whispered. "Why me?" "Because America doesn't just need heroes, Daniel," Colonel Harris answered, his gaze steady and unwavering. "It needs heroes who remember what it costs to wear the uniform after they take it off." Haunted by regret, Officer Richard Jacobs sat alone in his patrol car, engine off, staring blankly at the empty parking lot of the precinct. The digital clock on his dashboard blinked 4:37 a.m., the end of the longest shift of his career. His reflection in the rearview mirror showed a man he barely recognized, features etched with the harsh lines of a truth he couldn't escape. The image of Daniel Carter kept flashing through his mind, not the homeless man he had handcuffed, but the decorated officer from the photograph Colonel Harris had thrust into his hands. 2 versions of the same man, separated by circumstance and tragedy, and Jacobs had only seen what he expected to see. 23 years on the force, he whispered. To himself, his breath fogging the cold window. How many others have I missed? The parking lot had finally cleared of protesters and reporters, leaving behind only scattered signs and the lingering echo of chanted demands for justice. Jacobs leaned forward, pressing his forehead against the steering wheel, the cool leather, offering no comfort against the burning shame that had settled behind his eyes. A gentle tap on his window startled him. Officer Ramirez stood outside, 2 coffee cups in her hands, her expression neither accusatory nor sympathetic, just present. Jacobs hesitated before lowering the window, the barrier between himself and accountability sliding away with mechanical precision. "Thought you might need this," she said, offering one of the cups. He accepted it with a nod, the warmth seeping into his palm, serving as a stark reminder of the coffee Daniel had been denied. The simple comfort that had spiraled into, "You tonight's disaster. How did I get it so wrong?" Jacobs asked, the question emerging unbidden, hanging in the pre-dawn air between them. Ramirez leaned against the car, her breath creating small clouds that dissipated into the darkness. "You saw what you expected to see," she said simply. "We all do until something forces us to look closer." Inside the station, through the glass doors, Jacobs could see Sergeant Miller pinning something to the bulletin board, a memo or perhaps a new policy directive already born from tonight's events. Change rippling outward, triggered by his mistake. "Did you know?" Jacobs asked, turning to look at Ramirez. "When you first saw him in the cell, did you see past the homeless man to who he really was?" "No," she admitted, her honesty unflinching. "But I looked for his story instead of assuming I already knew it." The weight of 2 decades of similar assumptions pressed down on Jacob's shoulders. How many lives had he impacted without ever questioning his perspective? How many stories had he written in his mind before hearing a single word from those he was sworn to protect? "I need to fix this," he said, the words feeling inadequate against the magnitude of his error. "You can't undo what happened to Daniel," Ramirez replied, her tone gentle but firm. "But there are 100 more veterans out there right now, sleeping rough, fighting battles most of us can't imagine." Jacob straightened in his seat, something resolute settling into his expression. "Tell me how to help them." Ramirez handed him a business card with a handwritten note on the back, Captain Reynolds' contact information, and an address for the veterans' shelter downtown. "They need volunteers," she said. "People who understand the system, who can help navigate the bureaucracy, who can see them as people first." She paused, meeting his gaze directly. "They need officers who are willing to learn." Dawn was beginning to break on the horizon, pale light washing over the precinct parking lot, illuminating the first tentative steps of a long journey toward redemption. Jacobs tucked the card carefully into his pocket, the simple rectangle feeling heavier than his badge. "Is it too late?" he asked, the question hanging between them. "For Daniel?" Ramirez considered. "Maybe. For the next veteran you encounter, that's entirely up to you." One salute changed everything. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Fort Hamilton's training center, casting long rays across the polished floor where 30 young recruits stood at attention, their freshly pressed uniforms and eager faces contrasted sharply with the weathered appearance of the man who paced before them, his limp barely noticeable as he moved with purpose down the line. Sergeant Major Daniel Carter no longer resembled the forgotten man who had once huddled in doorways against the biting cold. His uniform fit perfectly across shoulders that had straightened with renewed purpose, his face clean-shaven, his eyes clear and focused. The ghosts still lingered behind those eyes, they always would, but now they fueled his mission rather than haunting his nights. "Your training will teach you how to fight." Daniel's voice carried the quiet authority that only comes from having walked through fire. "I'm here to teach you what happens when the fighting stops." The young soldiers watched him with rapt attention, their eyes occasionally flicking to the impressive array of medals and commendations on his chest, visible proof of the journey that had led him to this moment. None of them knew that just 30 days ago, this decorated hero had been sleeping beneath a highway overpass, invisible to the very society he had sacrificed everything to protect. Outside the training center, the base hummed with activity. The small apartment provided to Daniel as part of his position sat just a quarter-mile away, modest but clean, with actual walls and a roof that didn't leak. After years of homelessness, he still woke each morning momentarily disoriented by the comfort of a real bed, the luxury of running water, the simple miracle of safety. The transition back to civilian life can be harder than anything you'll face in combat, Daniel continued, stopping before a young recruit who couldn't be more than 19. When you return home, your battle doesn't end. Sometimes it just changes terrain. What the recruits couldn't see was the network of support that had materialized around Daniel in the weeks since his wrongful arrest had made national headlines. The story had struck a chord that resonated far beyond one man's experience, becoming a catalyst for change that rippled through both military and civilian communities. Captain Reynolds from the Veterans Advocacy Group now sat on a newly formed committee with Colonel Harris, working to identify and support homeless veterans before they fell through the cracks. The local business association had established a hiring program specifically targeting veterans transitioning back to civilian life. 3 local landlords had committed to reserving units for veterans in need of housing. Even Officer Jacobs had found his own path toward redemption, volunteering his off-duty hours at the downtown veterans shelter, using his knowledge of the system to help navigate the bureaucratic labyrinths that had once trapped Daniel and countless others like him. As Daniel dismissed the recruits for the day, his phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Miranda Chen, the VE psychiatrist who now saw him twice weekly for his PTSD, another door that had suddenly opened when his story became too loud to ignore. "Don't forget group tomorrow at 1700, the message read. "The new members are looking forward to meeting you." Daniel slipped the phone back into his pocket and gazed out the window at the American flag, waving in the afternoon breeze. The photograph of his wife and daughter remained in his wallet, their memory a bittersweet ache that would never fully heal. But alongside that grief, something new had taken root: purpose. In the parking lot, a van from the community outreach program waited to transport him to the city council meeting where he would speak about veteran homelessness. His words now carried weight, his experience transformed from shame into powerful testimony that could unlock doors for others still trapped in the shadows. 1 month ago, Daniel Carter had been invisible. Today, he was finally being seen. One mistake revealed a broken system. As the sun set over Fort Hamilton, casting golden light across the training grounds, Daniel Carter stood before a group of community leaders, police officers, and military personnel. His voice, once silenced by society's indifference, now commanded the attention of those with the power to create change. "My story isn't unique," Daniel said, his words carrying across the hushed audience. "For every veteran who finds their way back from the darkness, dozens more remain invisible on our streets, carrying medals in their pockets and battlefields in their minds." Among those listening sat Officer Jacobs, his expression solemn as he absorbed the painful truth of how quickly judgment had replaced compassion in his own heart. Beside him, Colonel Harris nodded in silent agreement, the weight of responsibility evident in his eyes. "We see what we expect to see," Daniel continued, gesturing to the diverse crowd before him. "A uniform, a suit, a shopping cart. These outer trappings determine who receives our respect, our compassion, our basic human dignity. But beneath every appearance lies a story we couldn't possibly understand at first glance. The setting sun illuminated the faces of those gathered, some wet with tears, others hardened with resolve. What had begun as one man's humiliation had transformed into a movement, a mission, a moment of national reckoning. Tonight, thousands of veterans will sleep on sidewalks in the shadow of the flag they once served. Tomorrow, will we see them? Will we remember that true justice begins with the courage to look beyond our assumptions? Daniel's gaze swept across the assembly, his voice growing stronger with each word. The measure of our society isn't found in how we treat those we admire, but in how we treat those we've forgotten. Every veteran deserves more than our gratitude. They deserve our action. As the last light faded from the sky, a silent promise passed through the gathering: to share this story, to challenge perceptions, to remember that behind every forgotten face lies a hero waiting to be recognized.